if continuous happiness, unbroken happiness, is not available in the form of life being magically pleasure, 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 but is available in the form of life being seen with an attitude of equanimity, meaning continuous happiness is available in the form of peace of mind towards what is happening in life. And if that peace of mind is the absence, the falling away of suffering, what does that look like in practice? In practice, it looks like a movement away from a thinking mind that is continually judging, continually blaming, continually feeling shame, continually worrying about the future, continually having expectation about the future. And that thinking mind is essentially a narrative, an ongoing internal narrative about the past, the present, and the future. A narrative that at its core, the thread, the theme, is the narrative of doership and attachment to outcomes. And that ongoing narrative, commentary about life, how it happened in the past, how it's happening now, how it might or might not happen in the future, has in it a very powerful capacity to affect how life is experienced, we could say. It has a very powerful capacity to color the present moment experience, which is all life ever is. Life is always this present moment, whatever it happens to be, including the narrative. The narrative is part of the present moment experience of life. So what I mean by that is our life has only ever been this moment. When we were 5 years old at our birthday party, life was that moment. And now life is this moment. So life is only and only ever has been this present moment experience. And this present moment experience can include this narrative, which is the thinking mind commentary about an imagined past. That's not to say that the past didn't happen, but it's not happening now. And yet the narrative about the past, why did my ex-girlfriend behave the way she did, becomes part of this present moment experience of life. And if that narrative is part of the present moment experience of life, then that experience of life is uncomfortable. Not uncomfortable because it's too hot or too cold, but uncomfortable on a level of self. It becomes the uncomfortableness that we have with life. It becomes, or it is, the resistance to life. It appears someone resisting how life was/is. And that someone resisting is essentially the narrative. Why did life happen like that? It shouldn't. There's the resistance. It shouldn't have happened like that. So in the narrative there is a resistor of life, but the resistor is actually part of a belief or part of the expression of the belief, the thought. So there really is no one resisting life other than an entity created as part of the narrative, which is why in an instant resistance can fall away, and it appears when that happens that the person has dissolved, whereas in fact what's referred to as the person is the particular content of the narrative. I wasn't good enough as a son. I should have been better, could be the narrative. Now my father is dead and I can't ever make amends. That can be the narrative. And the I that wasn't good enough comes into existence in the narrative. In the moment that the narrative falls away. Then there's presence. And the one that is ashamed dissolves with the narrative. So the movement is a movement where that narrative gets seen as a narrative, gets seen from an outside perspective. The very nature of the narrative is involvement, attachment. And so when there is involvement, there is no perspective. And so what is felt is the strong uncomfortableness that is created by the intensity of the narrative. So the more intense the narrative is, the more uncomfortable the feeling is. And when there is full involvement in a circumstance, so a full sense that this shouldn't have happened like this, and it was their fault and it was a complete injustice on me, when that is very intense, which isn't something that someone is, actively creating the intensity, it's a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes this belief system. And so that belief system will be a particular way which determines how intense the suffering and the narrative is. And when there is full intensity, there is no perspective. And so there is this feeling of being completely lost in the story. It doesn't feel like I'm lost in a story. There is a feeling of complete victimization, let's say, which is being completely lost in the narrative, having no perspective that this is just a narrative. Which is why suffering feels so real. The story, the narrative, is presenting itself as truth. The narrative says, this should not have happened. The person could have acted differently, should have acted differently. And what this means to me is that my life is completely over. That could be the narrative. And it doesn't at all arise as a story. It doesn't at all arise as a misunderstanding or ignorance. It arises with a feeling that this is absolute truth. That's full involvement, and that's the most uncomfortable. And as spiritual teachings come in and start describing, and that's all I'm doing, I'm just describing, I'm not telling someone how they should or shouldn't be. The doer might hear, oh, I shouldn't be involved, I shouldn't have a narrative. I'm not saying that, I'm just describing the narrative. And as the descriptions sink in, contemplating, seeing the narrative in a new way can happen. Not something that a doer is doing, but rather some information has come in, and as a result, things are seen from a new perspective. Not anyone's doing, but are happening as a result of things that happened before, including the descriptions, and then including how the descriptions took hold in a very complex system, which isn't in our control, including the subsequent contemplating that happens after the system has changed. And then the contemplating, when the narrative arises the next time, can lead to the narrative being seen. Oh, there's the narrative again. Or there's the narrative seen for the first time as a narrative. That's a very impressive moment when the narrative is actually seen from outside the narrative. That's where you could say witnessing has happened for the first time. And what is witnessing? The narrative. Sometimes it's a new narrative, witnessing the narrative, which isn't really witnessing. And other times, it's not a narrative commenting on the narrative, but a silent, effortless awareness of the narrative, as a narrative. And knowing that what I am is that which is aware of the narrative rather than the me that is generated within the narrative. That you could also say is a significant step of uninvolvement. The narrative is complete involvement, and the first time the narrative is seen as a narrative from a perspective that is outside the narrative, we could call that witnessing or non-involvement in the story. The story then can carry on. So still the narrative is, why did this person act this way? And something is aware of that thought movement, that thought momentum. And that something is not just something, it is I, the real I of the human being. Not an I that implies a separate entity, but the I that is the essence of the individual, the consciousness, you could say. And curiously, there's a reason why it's referred to as I, or I am. And it can also be a little confusing because our intellectual definition of I is usually the I that we know as our concept of who we are, which means I as a separate individual doer. And so the fact that we have usually assigned the word I a definition based on our experience, which, until a certain point our experience is, well, I am a separate independent entity that does everything that happens through me. And we refer to I did this, I did that, I this, I that. And so by default our definition of I is based on our unexamined experience of life. And then spirituality starts referring to I, but often they will try and distinguish that I from the I that we have known ourselves as historically. One of the ways is by saying, well, referring to the I that we have always known ourselves as me, rather than I, the me. The me is the doer, the one that wants things, which is the narrative, the one that wants life to be a certain way. And so then that becomes, or it can be referred to as the person. And the I then is the real essence of the human being that has been overlooked for years and years, then can be referred to as consciousness or awareness or isness or beingness or I amness. So the teachings will always try and create a distinction so that we know what we're talking about, and also allows the intellect to start drawing a new picture and seeing the difference between the narrative that includes the me that is so focused on getting its own way and having expectations about what it thinks it needs, which is a conceptual me, a me that comes into existence in a particular moment when there's a specific thought process happening. A me that can completely fall away when that thought process, for whatever reason, either because there's a lot of presence come into someone's system, meaning a recognition that that's just a story, and a movement where that starts getting cut off, or because they get distracted. So the narrative can be there and you can get distracted, and the suffering falls away while you're distracted. Which shows, this is why suffering is referred to as illusory or not real. It feels very real when it's there. It feels like the story that's being said is the truth. And yet it can fall away in an instant if you get distracted, or if there is a movement within the body that comes back to presence. And as soon as it falls away, it starts to be seen as not real. If something's real, it can't be there 1 minute and then not there the next. The definition of real is permanent, unchanging. So if we start to see our suffering as something that's there and then the next minute it can be gone, then we start to have very useful information that the intellect can start drawing conclusions about. How real is this if 1 week it's there and it's flooding my whole system, and the next week it's gone? And it doesn't have to be 1 week and another week, it can be 1 minute and then the next minute it's gone. And then it comes back. So when it comes back, if we've seen that it went for a minute, that's really powerful insight, because it comes back and it will flood the system, and it will feel real. It will feel like the story that's being told is the truth. And yet something inside of us might now have registered this is an imagination, a story, a thought form that has a very powerful effect. We can't deny the effect that suffering has on coloring the momentary experience. But it's something that is subject to change, and if we see that, then it becomes much more ephemeral than it was in the past. So this movement is a movement of that suffering getting cut off more and more and more than it did in the past. Getting cut off quicker and quicker and quicker until at some point it just simply doesn't arise anymore. So before seeking happened, it may well be that suffering could stay in place for 3 days when a situation happened. Not only 3 days, there's very many people who can tell you about something that happened 10 years ago that haunts them. Haunting basically means, I'm saying, it arises often enough where they have hatred or shame towards something that happened 10, 20, 30 years ago. And when that happens, it completely colors the experience of life. And so it hasn't been cut off in a long time, or it hasn't been uprooted. And the cutting off can start happening quicker and quicker and quicker as the understanding goes deeper and deeper. So really all the talking here is not for us to become more and more knowledgeable in a sense that we can, if asked, stand up and give a talk and say, look how much information I have. The teachings are there really so that the system becomes equipped with a way of seeing life that runs interference on the suffering narrative quicker and quicker than it used to. And the more deeply ingrained the understanding goes, the deeper and deeper it sinks, the more powerful that understanding is at coming up and cutting off the misunderstanding that is at the base of the narrative. And as the understanding goes deeper, it comes up automatically when there's something for it to... So it becomes a new commentary, but it's a commentary that is a commentary based on understanding rather than misunderstanding. So the suffering arises, which is a commentary based on something that happened, 5 days ago. And why did that happen? Why did this person treat me that way? There's an uncomfortableness in that. And then the working mind and awareness become aware of the suffering. There's the narrative. And if the narrative has been looked at before, it can very quickly be there's the narrative of blame. And if the understanding has gone in deep, there can be a recognition, I'm not the doer, and the other isn't the doer. That's the understanding that may have gone in very deep. If it's in very deep, there's just no question in your mind. You can't rationalize. It just doesn't make sense how to see myself or the other as a separate, independent doer. Now, there has to be a rationale, and that rationale is what we described yesterday, is that no one is ever insulated from life, so we are always an extension of life. The body-mind organism has never been insulated from life. It's a very complex machine that is always functioning exactly according to its design. And so if someone swears at me, it's not pleasant, but it's not the doing of a separate independent entity. I simply can't see the other or myself as a separate independent entity. It just doesn't make sense. Where is this isolated entity that has never been influenced by anything except for themselves? It's a ludicrous concept to think of myself as the other, as an isolated, independent entity that has never been influenced by anything. If that was the case, then any decision or any action that the person made would be their doing. Because it can't be linked to anything else, because they are independent and isolated. So if that's what the person is, independent and isolated, they are their own independent entity with complete volition. That is their own personal volition. But we're completely the opposite. We are an organism that is completely influenced by trillions of factors. So whatever we produce is completely the opposite of an independent output. It is completely interdependent output. And so someone will swear at me, someone will steal something, someone can hit me. None of those are pleasant things. They're all very painful, or can be very painful, depending on the circumstance and the biological preference, how hard the person hits you, is going to determine how painful it is. So this recognition of everyone being connected to life and one and part of life doesn't magically mean no more pain. It just means that I can't have the same narrative about the pain as was possible when life is seen differently. And in the meantime, the system can include both understanding and misunderstanding. So as the understanding is going deeper, there can still be remnants of the misunderstanding. And that means that someone does something, the blame arises, which is suffering. The uncomfortableness of that blame is there. And then the working mind sees it and says, there's that suffering, there's the blame. And it doesn't necessarily say, there's that. What happens is the concept might just arise, I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer. And that concept has the effect of just cutting off the narrative. Because it's really recognizing in that moment, this is a lie, this is an error. This story, this assessment is based on an incorrect perception of life, an incorrect understanding of how life actually functions. And with a deep understanding about something, the opposite story can't perpetuate. So it gets cut off. So, once again, all of the information is really there to bring us to silence. The silence that is there when the narrative gets cut off. And we remember who we are, essentially. 1 minute we can be lost in our self-image that is, judging the other and blaming and feeling attacked by the situation. Then that gets cut off. We drop into being, which means dropping into the felt sense of presence. And a little smile can come to our face because there's a remembrance. This is what I really am. Something that is invulnerable and untouched by circumstance. That's the coming to know oneself, coming to know that aspect of oneself that had been covered up by the misunderstanding of who we are, the misunderstanding of what life is. So the misunderstanding, I'm talking about misunderstanding ourselves as the doer, misunderstanding the other as the doer, and misunderstanding my completeness as being dependent on outcomes. So when that becomes the deeply ingrained sense of self, all of the movement is towards defending yourself, trying to control outcomes, control the other, insist that life is a certain way. And there's a disconnection from what we really are because we're now lost in this self-identity.
You just said if somebody insults you or blames you, it remains I know how
Painful.
painful. But how come? Well, I mean,
Because life is always a mix of pleasure or pain, and it will be pleasure or pain depending on whether the circumstance is in line with your biological preferences or out of line with your biological preferences. If the circumstance is in line with your biological preferences, it will be pleasure. If it's out of line with your biological preferences, it will be pain. Now, very clearly, I would much rather someone come up and say, you know, that was a great afternoon we spent together. You're a great friend.
but why? If you see straight away that there's no doership on the part of that individual, and none in this your individual either, I mean, then how come it still has...
So that's on the level of attitude. On the biological level, there are two potentials. Either someone says that was a great afternoon, or someone says that was really a waste of my afternoon. Two things. Which would I prefer to hear on a level of my biological preference? Clearly, it makes sense. Either we say there's no difference, like there is no difference between someone saying you are a great friend or someone saying you're a terrible friend. We can either say there's no difference, but clearly there is. Because on an emotion, so there is our biological preferences will lead to the three different types of pleasure and pain. Physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, financial pleasure and pain. And there is a difference. If someone takes $100 out of your wallet, there is a difference to if they haven't taken it out of your wallet. And so there is financial pain if someone steals the $100. If someone says you're a terrible friend, there is a difference between them saying you're a terrible friend or them saying you're a great friend. And we have to recognize this difference. So on a biological level, I can't have the same reaction to something that is different, because they're different. Just like if I put my hand under cold water, there is one biological reaction. If I then put my hand under boiling hot water, there is a different biological reaction. So we can't fool ourselves and say they're the same. They are different, and therefore they will be received by the biological organism differently. And so there is the pleasure or pain of being insulted or complimented.
Like an opening or closing of the body or
it's a biological difference. Now, the question is whether that biological difference of pleasure or pain turns into suffering. So, with the understanding that it's my destiny in each moment to deliver either the pleasure or the pain that arises. Not my doing, not the doing of the other, but destiny. Destiny, just another word for life is always going to be one way. I'm not in control of the one way it is. And so in each moment, when whatever happens, we can call it was destined to be that one way, because life only ever turns out one way. So with the right attitude, the pleasure or pain doesn't turn into suffering, which means it doesn't turn into hatred or shame.
And let's say if you have never developed let's say you have always been a realized being, does it still make that difference? Or, I mean, whether they tell you you're a great friend or a terrible friend, does that still make that biological difference because of the past your body has experienced? It has always opened up when somebody says you're a great friend, and always closed when you see what I mean?
Yeah, so the biological preference is not something that becomes present or absent because of understanding. So this is quite an important subtlety for us to realize that there is the biological makeup of the human being, and then the psychological makeup of the human being, both of which are a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. However, the psychological aspect of the human being is the result of specific type of conditioning or specific type of up-to-date conditioning. The up-to-date conditioning that has ingrained the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes. So if that falls away, the psychological aspect of the human being falls away, because new conditioning has come in that has uprooted the conditioning that put in place the psychological entity of doership and attachment to outcome. So if that's happened and it's fallen away, the biological aspect of the human being remains. And that means that the person may like the taste of strawberries or may not, according to their biological preferences. Now, there's a difference between liking and disliking the taste of strawberries, right, or preferring strawberries to broccoli, and insisting that life delivers strawberries. So the insistence that life delivers strawberries. So someone is coming around with a plate at a party and there's toothpicks and strawberries and there's one strawberry left, it's about to come to you and someone takes it. Your preference, and there's just a piece of broccoli left instead on the plate. And your preference could clearly be for the strawberry and not the broccoli. Life has not delivered the strawberry because someone took it just before it got to you. The psychological entity, if it is in place, will create a narrative about that circumstance and a narrative about the person who is so rude for having come in from left field just as the strawberry was going to be offered to you, and that's my strawberry and you've taken it, and what am I going to do about it? You know, all of that psychological attachment. And take someone where that psychological entity has fallen away, the preference for the strawberry, they see the plate coming and they go, oh, I know which I'm going to have, because their biological preference is still there. And they're about to, and someone swoops off, and they might laugh. It's not destiny. My destiny was for me not to have the strawberry in this moment. And so that understanding means no psychological story about he took my that strawberry was destined for me, and he of his own free will and volition has come in and messed up destiny, has ruined, disturbed the balance of the universe, is what our psychological entity is saying. And now something's gone wrong. Things are not as they should be. The alternative is it was destiny for, and always was, like the universe is in complete harmony only because he's come in and taken the strawberry at the last moment.
Yeah, I get it. It's like a baby who prefers to eat banana rather than something else. Yeah, right. Mm.
So the preference is there.
Yes.
Your attachment to the preference has fallen away.
And it stops as soon as the situation's over.
Yeah. So someone insults me. In the moment, the insult is there. The body receives the insult, and it's not my preference. But I accept it.
But is that because you haven't been realized all your life?
Perhaps? No, that wouldn't make a difference.
It wouldn't make a difference.
No. Because your realization isn't going to make an insult pleasurable.
Okay.
Even if you were, realized from birth, if you got smacked, it doesn't make the smack pleasurable. It's still painful, but there would be an acceptance of that child that is realized that smacking is part of the flow of life, which is pleasure or pain, and it was my destiny to be smacked even if, for example, I didn't do anything wrong. It just would be understood that it was destiny for that to happen, which is why this notion of realization at birth can only make sense if we look at the notion of past lives where understanding has happened in past lives and is somehow included in this life. Otherwise, realization before the intellect has been able to process things differently doesn't make sense. And past lives may or may not exist. We don't have definitive proof. We can see patterns that show a certain way of us relating to life at a certain age, which you could say was very strange. How did I relate to life that way when my friends are relating to life very differently, and life didn't give me any special treatment or for me to realize anything differently, really. And yet my movement at the age of 5 was, in hindsight, you could look back and say, very much in line with an understanding. And so that might be, for a person, a strong indication that there are past lives where changes happened in those past lives, and then that understanding somehow made its way into this particular manifestation. The same with, child prodigies that can play violins and stuff like that. So where did that come from? It's not an absolute proof, but it can start being an indicator. And then the question is, who lived the past life? Is it the past life of the person that is here now, or was it another life? And the experiences from that other person's life, John, somehow get transferred into Mary. But we can see that Mary didn't live a past life, because the past life was John. And then John's insights somehow get transferred and inserted into the instrument called Mary. So when we're looking at past lives, there are a lot of nuances to look at. At the end of the day, a past life simply means your up-to-date conditioning. So whether it comes from this life or a carryover from a past life, it still means that in each moment the human being is one way, their genes and up-to-date conditioning, and they will function according to their genes and up-to-date conditioning, which means if there's understanding in a person, meaning the end of the psychological identity, it's simply good luck based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning, not some personal achievement. Because Mary was lucky to have the insights of Peter, who died as a Buddhist monk, let's say, be part of her up-to-date conditioning.
Yeah, okay. I was actually just surprised when you said that you would find it painful to be insulted while knowing that there's no doership and that there's no... Yeah, okay.
But it's the same. If I know that the person that hits me isn't a doer, does that mean that the hit isn't painful?
No, I mean not hitting, but insulting.
Yeah, because it's the same. That's why we have to see that there are the 3 categories of pleasure and pain. Physical, which means this, and breaking a finger, and also tasting a strawberry or tasting a rotten piece of meat. They're all part of the physical, and the same with the sun hitting the skin, hot or cold water, temperature, the weather, sounds, whether there's a lot of noise and your preference isn't for noise. All of those you could say are physical pleasure or pain, sensory pleasure or pain. Then there is emotional pleasure or pain, which is the hardest one for us to get our head around, which is why you're having this confusion. Because when we think of emotional, we tend to relate to suffering. When we think of emotional pain, we assume it means suffering. Whereas emotional pain means not suffering, but simply I've done a job, someone says you did a bad job. Someone else, in another situation, I do a job and someone says you've done a great job. Now, the emotional structure will receive that information, and it prefers to have succeeded and be told that it's done well than being reprimanded. Another example of emotional pain is if your best friend dies and you get the information, your best friend unfortunately has died. Does it make sense that there will be emotional pain? As opposed to you being told, oh, your best friend that you haven't seen for 10 years is 5 minutes away. They're two different circumstances. And there is a biological preference, and one piece of information is going to be received differently to the other. And so that's the emotional pleasure or pain. Then whether that emotional pleasure or pain gets turned into suffering, which is different to emotional pain, is a question of the psychological makeup.
Can I ask another question?
Sure. Anger, incidentally, is another form of emotional pain. Biological. If it's just biological anger, that is a form of biological pain. When the psychological aspect of our identity gets hold of it, it then adds into it blame towards the person that has made me angry, or shame towards the fact that I got angry. And when that's the case, what we tend to feel is the combination of the biological reaction and the psychological reaction. And because the psychological component has such a power, essentially what we're feeling is the suffering, the blame, the shame. And we know I've got angry, and then we feel the combination of the anger and the suffering. And so anger can feel like it's not a biological reaction, but a psychological reaction. Because that's our experience of it. We'll get angry, and what we feel is the uncomfortableness of shame or the uncomfortableness of blame. Really, if we could separate them out, we'd see that the biological response of anger is different to the psychological response of blame and shame. But because the psychological is basically is a response because of attachment to pleasure and pain, when pleasure or pain arise, what tends to happen if the psychological entity is there is that the suffering will arise simultaneous to it. And so we don't get to know sadness or anger as just emotional pleasure or pain. We know it as the package, and it can take a fair bit of nuanced looking at it for us to start seeing the boundaries of the biological pleasure and pain, let's say the biological anger, the biological sadness, the biological sadness at being told I've done a terrible job, and where that turns into shame. Now, if shame doesn't arise, emotional pain is really very manageable. The emotional pain of hearing that your best friend has died is very manageable. It's not nice, it's not pleasure, it's painful, but it doesn't go anywhere into the level of self. It doesn't have any flavor that says a part of me has been attacked or a part of me has been lost. Whereas if the attachment to outcome is there, that emotional pain will get turned into a story of what does this mean about me, and then it has a very uncomfortable flavor to it. So this is part of the self-inquiry job, is to understand that the flow of life is the pleasure and pain component, and then there is our attitude to the flow of life, which is the suffering. That's one of the most important distinctions that we can have and understand intellectually, and then our awareness and our intellect starts landing on the two levels of biological pleasure and pain and attitudinal attachment or doership, which we can call suffering.
You were saying last night that usually the last bit that we don't want to give away is our thoughts, that we don't recognize the non-doership about our thoughts. Are emotions linked to that? Or are our thoughts just mixing up of emotions? And how can we see when it comes up that it's actually just happening and that there's nobody doing the feeling or whatever?
Yeah, so emotions and thoughts are very linked. Essentially, if you go into a feeling, an emotion, there is a thought at the core of the feeling. So feelings and emotions are essentially very intensified thought. And so obviously if that's the case, if feelings are intensified thought, then the fact that thought is the last thing to be seen as a happening and not my doing, which means until that happens, the me still exists in relation to thought. So the attitude of doership still exists in relation to the impersonal thoughts that just arise, that just happen, whereby ownership is claimed over the thoughts, my thoughts. And therefore that equates to emotions as well. So emotions and thoughts, when we understand, let's say, the other isn't the doer, or I'm not the doer of the pumping of my heart, much easier to understand. I'm not the doer of the pumping of the heart, or the functioning of the liver, or much harder for us to really click and see a thought is just happening. Whereas when we think about it, the heart pumps because of the structure of the pump, which is what the heart is, it's a pump. And so it's functioning. And the thought is, and as a result of the heart pumping, there is, differentials in pressure, which move blood around the arteries and whatever. So that's the consequence, is the movement of pressure and consequence of the pump. And thoughts are just a consequence of a very, very complex organ, the brain, that is functioning automatically. And, if you have ever had a brain dysfunction, just for a moment, where, I don't know, suddenly the vision starts to shake or move, it's because something's happened in the brain. And so if you've seen these experiments where a neurosurgeon can put electrodes into the brain and get someone to not recognize a picture, or not be able to put, they think they can cut the link between the left and right brain, and you won't be able to label something that you can label if the brain is intact. So if we start seeing these functions as being a direct correlation to a complex organ, then it starts to become more and more obvious to us that our thoughts are not the output of some entity that has volition, but rather the output of an entity that is a biological robot. Which, if I call the human being a biological robot, it doesn't diminish it down. We imagine robot and we think of something different to the human being, like a tin can type of thing. But calling us a biological robot doesn't diminish us down from what we are. So this biological robot, humans, are very, very complex biological instruments with the capacity to feel love and emotions and all of those sort of things. So seeing ourselves as an instrument doesn't suddenly mean we can't love and we can't feel. All of those are aspects, and we can't think. All of those are aspects of this amazing biological instrument. An instrument that we could say is what source or consciousness is using as a vehicle to experience life. So the personal consciousness experience is each of our personal experience in this moment that is an experience from the perspective of a particular body-mind organism, a divine instrument. The dinosaurs, if there were dinosaurs, at some point were the most complex instrument that source was functioning through to experience life from. So at that time, a dinosaur might have been the most complex instrument through which consciousness could experience life from. And human beings, in relative to dinosaurs, or that story, are a more complex instrument than a dinosaur. The brain is more developed. It doesn't mean it's any less mechanical or any less of a biological instrument, but it's a more complex one, which means more complex feelings, more complex thoughts, more complex intellect. Actually, life is pretty impressive when we come down to this present moment and think, well, that's the miracle, is that there is awareness. Each of us in this moment have awareness of life. Like, what is aware of life? It's remarkable.
Can we say that genes and up-to-date conditioning are perception?
Genes and up-to-date conditioning are perception.
Can we call all genes and up-to-date conditioning together perception, basically, in every moment or experience?
They are definitely a big part of that. If you took genes and up-to-date conditioning away, there wouldn't be any experience.
That's part of my question.
Mm-hmm.
So could you connect that conceptually with presence that which remains when the narrative falls.
Sorry, can we connect genes and up-to-date
Yeah.
conditioning with presence?
With presence, where how...
So there's two ways of looking at the human being. We can either say the human being is the biological instrument, and then a consciousness of source that is a consciousness from outside the human being, links to that instrument, plugs into it, in a sense. And then the result of the consciousness of source plugging into the vehicle results in personal consciousness. Personal consciousness is what each of us have in this moment. The awareness of this moment is awareness of life from your particular perspective. No one else has it.
Right. But that implies a duality, if there's a source.
But once again, what we're doing is we're putting forward a conceptual explanation. But actually the explanation, when you see it, it talks about a theoretical consciousness of source, a theoretical body, whereas actually if we talk about the source connecting to the body, at that point when there is connecting, there's not two anymore. It becomes one, the connection, the fusing, the joining, the union. And once again, conceptually, we can talk about the output of that union as being personal consciousness, and then someone then can say, oh, there's the duality again. You have the union of consciousness of source and the body, mind, organism, and then the output of personal consciousness. And output then means like something separate. But if we look at it again, there isn't this real separation except for in the concept. So we've got source and body as a union, and personal consciousness as a union, not separate from that. So that's when we can say the human being, conceptually we can break it down into consciousness of source, body, personal consciousness. But in actuality, none of those three that we have separated out into conceptual separates are separate. So then we can come to know ourselves as the human being, which means we don't know the three parts, we just know the end result, which is like this.
Yeah. And the I am-ness is also an experience, not the source. It's
the I amness is...
When seen like that, I understand that they're one.
Mm-hmm. So that I amness is definitely a component or an aspect of the experience, the human experience, and we can separate it out conceptually by talking about I amness, but actually there is no separation in the experience. Everything... So in a meditation you could become aware of the I amness, in a way that maybe during daily living it's not as recognized. And in daily living there can be the sense of pleasure if someone's rubbing your hand, and yet the I amness is still part of the overall experience, it's just more in the background. And so attention can be on the pleasure, but actually there is the singular experience, which includes the pleasure of your hand being rubbed and the sense of I am as a complete package. But that complete package at different moments has different components of it that are more pronounced. So the pleasure will then subside and turn into a new momentary experience where different components are pronounced. And those different components can seem like they're separate, but they're actually all part of the present moment experience, which includes the sense of existence, the sense that I am the person in the chair, is because the I amness is running through the experience.
And that is what you call presence in your language, in your...
Yes, or at least...
Is there a difference between I amness and presence?
Yes, I would say that presence refers to the thinking mind not being active, and a particular attention on the fact that all of this is here, and that this is all there is, as far as, we can conceptualize about the universe being very big, and there can be all sorts of evidence about that, and we don't need to say it doesn't exist. But in our experience, this is really all that we will ever know.
Yeah, that's clear.
That which is right here. And so presence to me is coming into this present moment, which doesn't mean knowing the universe as in Jupiter and what's way beyond. It's about knowing the universe, which is this experience right now, which extends as far as our field of awareness extends. So if you're in a very small room, the universe in practice in that moment is pretty small. If you're on the top of a mountain, the universe is bigger than when you're in a small room, but it's nothing like the conceptual size of the universe that extends out for 300 billion light years or whatever it is. So the universe is really as big as, in practice, in presence, as big as your momentary experience. And if we come back to that, meaning our thinking mind and even to some extent our working mind stops, then that's presence. And in that presence, the sense of I am is more evident because it's not covered up with a lot of other components of the momentary experience, especially suffering, which tends to be a very thick blanket, so to speak, on the sense of I amness.
Hi, Roger. There was a witnessing of the commentating. So that was quite a prudent thing to say. The thinking mind, does it ever cease? Because I've got a confusion that it's something that's to be taken away permanently.
The thinking mind can cease if the beliefs from which the thinking mind arise, or you could say the beliefs are the thinking mind, and then certain expressions of the thinking mind, suffering, are expressions of the belief. Mm-hmm. The whole thing, the belief and its expressions, can collapse if life reconditions us such that those beliefs just don't have any ground anymore in the system. Right? So they're dissolved, where we just simply can't see. So after 20 years of seeing life this way, moment after moment after moment, so whenever I say something, whenever I see someone else doing, it's always seen in the light of me or the other being an expression of life. Mm-hmm. So the old way, which was very, very strong prior to life being seen that way, because it was based on how life was experienced. Life on the surface is experienced as me being a separate, independent entity with complete volition. That's what the experience of life presents as on the surface. And so that's why the deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment is in place, because from the very young age of 2.5 or 3, the brain has developed and language has come in and created this sense of a separate entity. And so the experience of life is of a separate entity, and that reinforces the beliefs, which are not beliefs we've created, but beliefs that have been put in place because the experience of life, as a result of the evolution of the human being, is a certain way. So those beliefs of doership and attachment are deeply, deeply ingrained, and that's why the thinking mind is there, because those beliefs are there, and that's why suffering arises automatically as an inevitability. It's only if life then starts to deliver information that changes our conditioning, such that the beliefs of doership and attachment stop making sense. And they are uprooted, and then the thinking mind can't sort of just appear again, because the deeply ingrained beliefs that were the thinking mind have dissolved. So it is possible for the thinking mind to fall away completely, forever. The process of that happening is a process whereby the thinking mind tends to come and go. And as it's coming and going, it's getting weaker and weaker. And at some point, if it gets weaker, it means the beliefs are getting weaker, right? So if we can see the beliefs getting weaker, doesn't it make sense that at some point the belief can be completely annihilated as being something that makes sense to the system? And if that happens, then blame, how can you blame someone? Because blame is it's an effect, so it needs a cause. And the cause is the belief in personal doership.
Okay, just one more thing. I've heard a lot of your teachings post-shift, and how do you incorporate that into your satsangs? Because you obviously have a variety of people that come,
Mm-hmm.
and so when to know, how do you deal with that, if you know what I mean?
So it's post-shift in a sense if someone has had a shift.
Yeah.
Then if someone has had a shift, and what I mean by a shift is when different teachings that point out that there's no person, for example, or whatever methodology is used, create a very significant insight that there's no one here, for example. That is a shift that I know has happened for a lot of people, because I know that there are a lot of teachings out there, very profound, powerful teachings that are out there with a lot of people plugged into them and resonating with them. So there are going to be a lot of shifts, insights, realizations that are happening. And so if someone in that position then listens to these concepts, I know from personal experience, because that's where I came in contact with these concepts, that these concepts then provide a lot of what is needed after the shift in order to bring about an integration. So I can put forward the concepts and know that if someone has come from a top-down Advaita awakening style teaching, pointing at you are consciousness, you are not the body, that has delivered a result of the consciousness aspect being realized, I know that I can put forward the concepts and they can be very useful in that situation. If someone hasn't come through that pathway, these concepts in themselves are very useful for someone that hasn't gone through that other pathway we've been talking about. What will happen in that case is that the realization and the shift will take a different form to the realization or shift that happens through a different teaching. So, given that's the case, I tend to not have to worry about who's listening, because I know that this particular set of concepts can be very useful post a top-down awakening teaching, or it can be very useful to actually someone who hasn't heard any of the concepts before, because it puts it in pretty simple language. As we're looking for happiness, what covers up happiness is suffering. Happiness turns out to be peace of mind, which is the end of suffering. So let's look at what suffering is. Suffering is your attitude to what happens in life. It's an attitude based on the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes. That attitude in practical terms arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. These are all descriptions. Don't take them as a prescription. If the description sinks in, someone who has listened to the talks for the first time, who has not been involved in any spirituality, could walk out the door, could realize that someone, or could see that someone has parked a car behind their car and they can't get out, and they've been told that that person is now 100 kilometers away and no one has the key. The circumstance is painful. Blame towards the person who has left their car there might arise. And in an instant, the working mind that has just come out of a talk, that has heard these descriptions for the first time, might say, this is blame towards the other. And what if life is actually a much bigger thing in which the other functioned the only way they could, which really means that life, that this situation is part of life and not because the other did what they did, and it's not possible to say the other should have done something different, because that should have is essentially an assessment of life different to the concepts that have been put forward in this talk. So what if that's actually what life is? What if there is no one to blame for this situation? What if this is just my destiny, the only way the story of life could have turned out? What if this is that turning out that way? And that there are two options. There's either the option of resistance or what we would call acceptance, which is the non-arising of resistance. All of that could, in theory, happen to someone who has not been a spiritual seeker, has heard the teachings for the first time, because we're talking about fairly simple, practical, psychological movements. And in that instant, someone could say, could have an insight, I simply cannot be the doer. The other simply cannot be the doer, on the basis that it's clicked. That, that person, their brain was functioning a certain way when they parked their car. That way their brain was functioning either didn't recognize that they were blocking me in, didn't care that they were blocking me in, didn't even see that they were blocking me in. Whichever it is, it happened. And it happened because the complex organism that is the human being functioned the way it functioned. And in that moment, it can be, I simply cannot be the doer. The other simply cannot be the doer. It's all a happening. And that insight is as profound as any oneness experience. In fact, if that insight happens, I would say it's more significant to what we're really looking for, because a oneness insight is only useful in practical terms if it penetrates down to the level of the implication of non-doership. The implication that there is no one here that is a doer, there is no one here that is ultimately affected on a level of self by this circumstance. Only there is someone here who's affected on the level of biological pleasure or pain. There is someone here who might have to pay for a hotel and stay overnight, cancel plans that they had. So all of that. But if we can drop in and find this place inside of us where I am, even while I'm in a hotel, I am, and who's to say that I shouldn't in this moment be in a hotel? Who's to say that God has got it wrong? Other than the doer or the me that has an idea of how life should be looking in this moment.
Okay, the doership has been seen. It was seen quite a long time ago, actually, but I still have this, like, I just want to be left alone kind of feeling, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm fine with what I do and how I go about my life. I'm very close to my brother, who is a very much a doer and a achiever, and he's constantly, I mean, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be here actually paid for, you know, so things go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
But there's almost a dragging into or out of my non-doership. To put it in.
Yeah, if someone tells you you're a doer, often enough, you can fall back into that until the understanding is just so strong that there's just no way of believing what they're saying. And that's a process. The process starts off with us seeing very, very clearly, I'm not a doer. And in that seeing, it will feel like, well, it can't go any deeper. How can it possibly go any deeper than the seeing that I'm having in this moment, which is an insight I'm talking about, where it clicks. And so the click is not just some sort of logical A leads to B leads to C and therefore I can't be the doer. It's all of that contemplation, and then in a certain moment everything clicks into place, and the insight is not of our common intellect, but it's insight of many more faculties, let's say, of the human intelligence than just logic. And in that moment, it's like, there's no way that this understanding can go deeper. And yet, a week later, we've flopped out of that understanding, and we find ourselves blaming and feeling dragged out of our position. And that simply is the normal path for the course. That's how the understanding goes deeper. Because the system, our body system, includes so much energy from the past that is repressed suffering. And in that repressed suffering, there are threads of doership and attachment to outcome. That's all that repressed energy is. So in that moment when there's that insight, I simply cannot be the doer, what doesn't happen is the magical extraction of all of the repressed energies from the past when we had no notion of doership or non-doership. What doesn't happen is the magical extraction of this load of guilt and shame and expectation and worry, what can happen is a part of that comes out. So in the insight, there can be a whole lot of laughing, hysterical laughing, a whole lot of crying, that feels very much like a cathartic release. It is a cathartic release. And so often those insights do come with a release of energy, but it doesn't tend to be the full load that is released. And so the process then is a matter of the supporting pieces of the puzzle around the core insight that we've had coming into view that have the effect of deepening the understanding, even though without them we still had this click, I get it, but we got it in a way that it can still sort of fade away. So then the process is more and more little pieces coming in that make the understanding even deeper, and along the way more and more of this energy finds its way out of the system, because the system is no longer locked down with chains and padlocks over all of the doors suppressing this energy. Those chains are breaking open because of the insights that have had, and the energies make their way up and out over time. Probably, if it all came out in one go, the system would fry itself. It just isn't designed to have that much energy move through it. The pipes aren't big enough, let's say. So the intelligence of the system, and there is a huge intelligence in a human being that is governing even our insights. And I'm not talking about God as an intelligence, I'm talking about the intelligence, whatever it is that designed the immune system, for example. The intelligence that designed a brain with billions of, a neural network that is extremely complex. There is a great intelligence, so that intelligence, to me, will manage the process of insight in a way that doesn't blow us up. And the fact of the matter is it takes time.
Okay, but one really, really quick last thing. If you went to America and you were unfortunate enough to be walking past a homicide and the police grabbed you up and then you were put on death row,
Mm-hmm.
say at the age, at your age, and how would you...
It would be completely understandable to me. Not at all good. Not at all what I would like.
Yeah.
But understandable in the sense that how someone functions is understandable to me if there's a psychopath. Right? Their actions are not pleasant or good. I'm not condoning them. I'm saying they're understandable based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if a policeman is corrupt and they put me as the perpetrator of the crime in order for someone else to not be investigated, that's completely understandable to me. It's completely understandable that the real perpetrator of the crime, if they have enough money and connections, will want to protect themselves. It's completely understandable that a policeman might want to improve their financial situation, regardless of the fact that an innocent man might be killed, based on the attachment to outcomes that is in that person. And it's understandable. It's how life is. And to me, life only ever has one course. And so if I found myself, and that one course is dictated by physics, essentially. Everything that's happening in life is physics, even thinking. And so in this teaching, there's a concept there that says everything that happens in life is completely predetermined. Now, the point of the predetermined doesn't mean it's all decided ahead of time. Another way of looking at it is that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And so if a bird lands on a stone on a mountain and its weight tips the stone and it flies off, but the stone rolls down the mountain and then hits another stone that is precariously perched, and that's a heavier stone, and then an avalanche ends up happening and people get killed, and then there is a funeral service, and then at the funeral service there's a murder. All of that, to me, is the predetermined story of life happening because of physics. The first part of the physics that is in this story is the bird landing on the stone and the weight of the bird tipping the stone, and A leads to B leads to C. There's a lot more of physics before that, in terms of the bird had to be born, it had to grow. And what I'm saying is that the exact movements of the bird inside, the growing of the bird, is all physics. And the bird flew out of the nest at exactly the time that physics dictated that. The bird didn't choose, oh, I think I'll fly out of the nest today. Just like the baby doesn't say mama for the first time because the baby chooses, oh, I'll say mama now. It says it at the exact time that the face of the mother comes into view, and the baby's brain has developed sufficiently, because of all of the conditioning that came before, for the physics in the brain to create a chain that the word mama comes out at the same time of seeing her at a particular moment. And so when we look at this, that bird in the egg form grows exactly according to physics. The egg cracks open according to physics. If a bird thinks, the thinking process is physics. So Stephen Hawking's, in one of his documentaries, or a documentary that is a narrative of Stephen Hawking's theories, says, make no mistake, thinking is simply physics. And this is what Ray mentioned it, and mentioned it again here this morning, is that thinking is the last aspect to be seen as a happening, not my doing. And when the thinking is seen as an output of a brain, of a machine, of an instrument, that is complex, but according to Stephen Hawking, says, make no mistake, thinking is just physics. The movement of electromagnetic impulses in a very complex neural network. Electromagnetic impulses in a neural network. Now, we don't experience our thoughts as physics simply because we don't know what physics feels like. Physics in the form of thought is exactly what we experience thought as, which feels very personal, but it's physics. And so the thinking that is part of what made the person commit the homicide at the funeral, which was a consequence of the bird landing on the stone, all of that was as mechanical and physics-based as the growing of the bird fetus in the egg and the cracking open of the egg. So it's not personal. So I happen to be walking past the spot of the murder because of the very complex physics of life. That means everything in every moment is exactly as it's destined to be. And so with a certain understanding, you would see that I'm in prison, not pleasure a lot of the time compared to being outside of prison. And yet attitudinally, this shouldn't be the way it is. Why is life happening like this? Doesn't exist. If life is seen to be this unfolding of something much bigger than you, me, or anyone else, that you, me, and everyone else and the way they act is part of this mystery of life. Which would mean equanimity, i.e. the absence of the thinking mind, only if destiny has brought about, according to impersonal physics, the dissolving of the thinking mind. Right? If that had happened, which is all destiny, all impersonal physics, then it would mean living out one's life on death row, experiencing the pleasure and pains of the flow of life in prison without suffering, without the guilt, the blame, the pride, the expectation, the worry, which is all an attitudinal load on top of the pleasure and pain of the circumstance. And that wouldn't be something that someone has achieved. So at least the person with that attitude, the attitude itself is an attitude of non-doership, right? So it knows, I didn't do this attitude. This attitude is an impersonal happening according to physics, according to everything that came before. And so, no pride for that, because if there was pride for it, that would be another form of doership and suffering. And not only no pride, but it's effortless in a sense. It's the absence of suffering is simply a consequence of the fact that the thinking mind has been dissolved. And it's available to everyone if destiny, if the impersonal complex domino system of cause and effect unfolds a particular way, this ending of suffering is available to everyone. And the fact that it has been happening in history for thousands of years, starting with, I don't know who the first person that wrote about it was, but sort of goes back at least 2,500 years. The fact that it started happening for people is a sign that it's the beginning of the evolution, the human evolution. And so the very first person was the first person in which the change happened. And then it happened to more people because that person started explaining what they'd realized or what the changes were. And so that becomes part of the sequence of it happening for more and more people. So it's the movement of an evolutionary wave that gathers more and more momentum. And the way I see it is that at some point, all of humanity will be enlightened. And enlightened simply means the dissolving of these attitudes or these beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome, whereby we will look back at history and say, well, at that point of human evolution, there was so much hatred in the world because evolution still included so much doership and attachment to outcome. That doership and attachment to outcome is such a simple thing to undo because the concepts to undo it are not particularly complex. And so then we'd say, well, why has an intelligence that has been able to develop an immune system and a brain that is so complex not been able to deal with such a simple error? And my assessment of it is that it hasn't dealt with it because the time hasn't been right to deal with it. Because up to relatively recently, attachment to outcome was probably a healthy evolutionary requirement for humanity to get to a point where it could actually survive in life without being attached to outcomes. Whereas when humanity was living in less developed worlds, they had to be worried about tigers, about how they're going to get their food. And so an attachment to outcomes, when humanity wasn't able to survive easily, might have been an evolutionary necessity. And evolution works slowly so that that which was needed is now not needed, but can't be gotten rid of too quickly. And that's why I would say that this doership and attachment to outcome exists at this stage, not because the intelligence isn't developed enough to get rid of it, because it's a very simple thing to get rid of, but rather because the intelligence was able to figure out that if it got rid of it 5,000 years ago, humanity may not be here today.
Yeah, and sorry, because no one else put their hand up. And it's a testament to everybody here that we're the lucky ones in the flow of life, because we're here to hear the message and hopefully witness the message, you know. Because when I was in Copenhagen, I'd strike up a conversation with somebody who I thought was quite like-minded. They'd say, "Yeah, so what you doing in Copenhagen?" I'm going on a spiritual retreat. They'd say, "Oh, sorry." And it was like, okay. Or some more expletives I won't mention, but it just really wasn't understood. I thought it would be, you know.
Yeah, well, Ramesh used to say we're God's favorites. The whole universe has conspired, all of that physics that needed to happen happened for each of us to be here. I know one or two, let's say here, not necessarily because the thought arose in them to come, but because maybe some external factors influenced the movement more or in a way that was needed. And whether that ends up being a positive or not for that person or those groups of people, for any of us here, is not in our control, because we're not in control of what life delivers in this period. We're not in control of how that lands in our system and what effect follows. However, the reason Ramesh said we're God's favorites is because if there is going to be a positive change, whereby certain conditioning of doership and attachment to outcome does dissolve, it makes sense that it's going to happen when life delivers concepts which are generally not available out there. Generally not the concepts that are spoken about in other environments or settings. So if life is going to bring about the change, it makes sense that it's going to do it by exposing us to these sort of concepts. Just for the recording, if we...
You mentioned concepts sinking in and the energy load coming out. So how does that manifest, or does it manifest at all?
It's a good question. Let's see if we have time, because that's a whole satsang in itself. We do have a bit of time. So there are different phases, and the different phases are usually encouraged by different sets of pointers. One of the very important phases is for us to start witnessing everything as a happening, especially witnessing the feelings that arise in the body as a happening, the thoughts that arise in the body as a happening, the words that come out as a happening, the movement of the hand as a happening, the turning of the tap as a happening, the getting in the car and driving as a happening, which really means seeing all of that as an automatic movement of a conditioned instrument that, and so conditioned isn't a bad word. In spirituality, often it is a bad word, but in this framework, we're always going to be conditioned. And we have to be conditioned. We are conditioned instruments. And the only conditioning that is a problem is the conditioning of doership and attachment to outcome. When that dissolves, we'll still be a conditioned instrument. So knowing how to use a knife and fork is because of conditioning. Knowing how to speak and language is because of conditioning. Knowing how to do mathematical calculations is a result of conditioning. How to drive a car, conditioning. How to walk, conditioning. And so understanding that means that we can see the speaking as a happening as a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. It still continues to happen. It's just witnessed by an aspect of the person that seems to be separate for a while and seems to be separate from the body that is doing the speaking, but actually it's not separate because that would be a new duality. It is part and parcel of, we could say, either life, that which witnesses, or even part and parcel of the person. And so that witnessing, which doesn't require us to stop doing what we normally do, so we're on our way to work and the witnessing can be there. We can be in work, in a meeting, on a telephone call, with this witnessing the conversation happening as a happening. When the witnessing phase is happening, we tend not to feel and be in the body as much as before. And that can be a relief. There is a bit of this space, in a way. It creates a perspective. It's the non-involvement. Witnessing as almost like an audience, or a witness of an accident, let's say, or a witness of a play, without being in the thing that is being witnessed. And when suffering arises, the concepts can come in and create a movement back towards the witness. For example, everything is happening, everything is predetermined and unfolds exactly as it's destined to unfold. Those concepts can bring about a shift from involvement in what's happening to being the witness of what's happening. And that's very important, to create a grounding in that part of ourself which is unaffected, untouched by what is actually happening. And we know that experientially. It's self-confirming. When we rest in being and this witnessing is happening, we can see that we've missed our plane, for example. Not good, but we are able to take this witnessing position and know, oh, I still am. I'm still complete, even though I've missed my plane. At some point, though, energies of suffering start coming up, and it can feel very uncomfortable. And if all we know is this witnessing instruction or pointer, not really instruction, I'll take that back, but if all we know is a suggestion to witness that which arises, then that is the movement that keeps happening, even when the suffering energy arises. And at a certain time, it doesn't feel quite right. Earlier on, dropping into this witnessing was an amazing relief. It seemed to be, and it was exactly what was needed. At another phase in the process, it's not needed anymore. What's needed is something different, to feel. And if we keep witnessing, then the movement that is required to feel doesn't happen. So it's important for us to hear that at a certain time, this movement to being the witness is not appropriate. What is appropriate at a certain time is to put all concepts, even though they're accurate, aside. Put the concept, I'm not the doer, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, aside, because at the right time those concepts cut off suffering and bring us back to a grounded place. But if it's continually applied, it can prevent us from feeling energies that are in the system that need to be fully felt in order for them to be released. Now, when the concepts have been telling us that blame is essentially a movement that is based on misunderstanding, that shame is the same, that worry and anxiety is the same, based on a misunderstanding, if an energy of blame comes up, there can be quite an understandable movement to not entertain it, to not, well, that's the best word, to not entertain it. But in fact, what might be needed is to put all of the concepts away, to not try and cut it off, to not try and when I say not try, when the concepts are working automatically and the understanding of non-doership has been sinking in, we understand that the seeking is happening and there isn't someone trying to do it. The concepts that my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life can come up quite automatically. When a period of suffering comes in and they don't come up automatically, we then might try to make them come up to deal with the suffering. Whereas the movement in that period might be not one of cutting off that is required, but one of feeling. Feeling the deep energy of blame, for example. And if we haven't heard a description that explains why that is so important, there'll be a hesitancy in the system to actually acknowledge an energy of blame, because the system also knows that blame is misunderstanding. So the system, when I'm talking about the system, I'm talking about our understanding, our intellect, needs to receive information that says feeling the energy and allowing it to move is allowing a pathway from the unconscious, where these energies of doership and attachment to outcomes are held and suppressed. It's allowing a pathway for them to come out of the unconscious and get atoned, get transformed from one energetic form into another energetic form. Just like burning a piece of wood. You put a piece of wood into a fire and it's solid wood. An energetic process happens and the wood is turned into heat and at the end of it, the wood isn't there anymore. And these energetic loads of doership are a bit like that. They're energy in a specific form, and they need to go through a transmutation process for them to change form and be released. And how does that happen? That happens when the energies start coming up from the unconscious in a way that sort of overwhelms the system, and knowing that it can be very beneficial to feel this, to allow it to develop, to flower into an intensity such that what is in the unconscious gets felt in a way that all the detail can really be seen, which might mean reliving experiences that we had completely forgotten about, reliving experiences that are very uncomfortable at their core. And in order for that to happen, rather than for it to be pushed back down, because it's uncomfortable and there's a fearfulness to see certain aspects of ourselves, there's a fearfulness to recognize the rage that can exist in our system. Unless we understand why it's beneficial, as soon as that pops its head up, the system will do everything it can to look in the other direction. So the explanation here is that those energies do contain our beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome, and for as long as they remain in the system, we will continually find ourselves going out in life presenting pain, and automatically our response to that pain is going to be of doership and attachment to outcome, guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And we might say, why does this keep happening? I've seen deeply that I'm not the doer, and I've seen from time to time that even in the face of pain, I can find myself grounded in my being and be at peace. Why is it that I find myself in circumstances and that understanding goes out of the window and the response is one of blame and guilt? And the answer is because in the system, on an unconscious level, there are all these loads of doership and attachment to outcome, which really means beliefs in the system that I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. That's an example of where the understanding is going deeper, and there is an understanding there, and yet there is still a misunderstanding. So we have competing understandings or misunderstandings in the system. And so part of that liberating itself is those energies coming out. So if we're really looking for the end of suffering, those energies need to come out, and that can become our motivation to feel that which doesn't seem to make any sense to feel, which is why historically the body has suppressed it. Because the body has said, this makes no sense to feel, so let me put it in a place that I don't have to feel it. That's what the intelligence, which is the limited intelligence of the body, had come up with, given its assessment of life. It had felt suffering in relation to a painful situation. It didn't have the tools for that suffering to dissolve because it was seen as unreal, and so the best it could do is suppress it and hide it. And it hides it in the body, essentially, in muscle groups, in different good hiding spots. And as the system opens up, as the beliefs tend to change, those energies that are contained in the biological, in the physical body, start to move around. It's just like unblocking. If you unblock a pipe that is connected to a whole series of pipes, and water gets to move in a section of pipe that was blocked, everything else has to rebalance itself in a closed system. So as the beliefs start changing, the energetic network changes because the beliefs are directly linked to the energetic network. So as our beliefs change, then some of the energies get released and there's a rejigging of the whole energetic system. And at a certain point, some fairly significant releases and changes are due to happen. And they start being, that phase is indicated when we start feeling these uncomfortable energies start to arise, where the witnessing tends to not have the same effect as it used to. And that's our signal that maybe now is time for us to just put aside any notions that, we're looking for enlightenment, and blame and hatred and shame and whatever is the opposite of that, and understand that we are looking for enlightenment, and feeling all of this is part of a movement in that direction. So that becomes the rationale, the motivation for us to do something that previously made no sense.
I only wonder, Roger, I think I have some belief in me that when the suffering arises, I need to know the story in the uncomfortable feeling, like a lot of shame I'm going through.
Mm-hmm.
How important is it with the story about it, or only the experience of it, or is it different? You need to.
Well, the experience of it tends to reveal the story, because as you experience it, you see in the emotion of it, let's say hatred that you simply didn't know was there.
Because I can see that the doer sometimes want a story about it.
Yeah. So knowing what the story is at the base of some of the energies in the system is important, because as you see the details of the story, the seeing of the details is part of the rejigging of the energetic network, which is part of the release. So as you get more hints of what your particular story is, whether it's shame, and then specifically shame in relation to what incident, or what series of incidents, and what are the common themes between them. And you can't know that until the energies start moving and you start expressing and feeling, the shame, and seeing that there's shame in relation to something that happened when you're 35, there's shame in relation to something that happened when you were 21, and shame when something that happened when you were 3. Right? And you see the series. That then enables you to be a bit like a investigator that's putting pictures of suspects up on the wall and linking this with this and all your little bits of evidence. And when you look at your evidence board, at some point it really becomes clear, and that clarity can become part of a very significant insight that is very significant at shifting, once again, all of these things. But none of these things are things that a doer needs to do, because this is far too complex for us to know how to do it. The good news is that the intelligence in the body has it sorted, and information, descriptions are good to receive. So in the talks, we've been talking about the witnessing, very important, but also how feeling at another time is a movement that is more appropriate at a certain time. But then the doer might say, okay, so which one do I need to do? How do I know which one is appropriate? That's where the doers come in and says, well, I better control the situation, which is not really what's intended by the information. The information is, here's the information, it's come into your system, now don't worry. You know, you don't have anything to do. Because the automaticness of the system that has always been there will function with that information. Undoubtedly, the doer will come in and grab hold of it, and then you can
try to create a story in some way. You can see the creating force.
Yes,
almost that I want to get rid of it in some way.
Yeah. Then so you could have a story of being the victim that gets created, or a story that is I am the one that is going to get rid of these things, or the one that wants to get rid of these things. But when that happens, which is an inevitability all the way along in the spiritual seeking, because the doership dynamic is so strong that if it hears me say, peace of mind or happiness for the human being is peace of mind. Peace of mind is the end of suffering. That's just a description. I haven't told anyone to do anything, right? But peace of mind, which is the end of suffering, sounds good compared to suffering. So the doer hears that and says, okay, so I have to do this. This is what I have to achieve. This is what I want to achieve. And then the next thing it says, so how do I get rid of the belief in doership? Right? And I haven't told anyone to get rid of the belief in doership. In fact, I've said we can't do it because there is no doer. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, because clearly we see how it happens, but it happens as an automatic functioning of life at a certain point in some people's lives. Then this intelligence kicks in. So if inevitably the doer does grab hold of some of the concepts, it's okay in a way. In fact, it can be very okay. The doer grabs hold of it, tries to do it, gets very frustrated because it can't do it, and the very doership energy is the opposite of what has been spoken about. So the more the doer tries to do it, the more suffering there is in the system. The more the doer then tries to do it better, which is more suffering, and at some point you go, I can't do this. And it might even realize, well, I've been trying to do non-doership. And that is more doership. And so the fact that the doer grabs hold of a concept that isn't meant to be an instruction, but rather just a description, is part of the process, and it turns out to be helpful. Once the system has been equipped with a description of what suffering is, because it then catches it. It says, wow, this, even though it's the best of intention, it's once again the doer trying to make this happen yesterday.
Going back a little bit to what you talked about in the beginning about the cutting off process, also linked to what Hélène said. Is it something that, in your experience, is completely subconscious, or can you see some of this cutting off happening?
No, actually there probably is a lot happening in the subconscious, but the cutting off I'm talking about is definitely in the conscious realm, where the blame kicks in towards a friend that has, cancelled on a holiday, let's say. The blame kicks in. And because the system is equipped, the working mind picks that blame up, just like we then have a radar system that is, calibrated to pick up suffering. So the blame towards our friend arises, and straight away our radar system picks it up. And so it only picks it up because it's in the conscious. And at the same time as the radar picking it up, the deeply ingrained understanding, or the deepening understanding, might automatically throw up a concept that is appropriate to that. The concept could be, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, because we're blaming our friend for cancelling, which means the outcome is, now I'm going on a trip on my own. I wanted to go on a trip with my friend, and so this is pain. So we're blaming them for delivering pain, which we see as an attack on who I am. And so all in an instant, when that blame arises, our radar picks it up as suffering. And then the thought automatically might arise, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. Which really means there's no one to blame for attacking me. Whereas the story was saying, there is someone to blame for attacking me. That someone is my friend that has cancelled our arrangement. My happiness isn't to be found in outcome, which means I am still complete even in the face of his cancellation. So the cutting off, which all of that could happen in the space of a second, or it could take 10 minutes, or it could take 5 hours, or 3 days, depending on, one, the intensity of that suffering energy, and the deepness of our understanding.
But it's not something that you do.
No, because the understanding is something that goes deeper and deeper as a natural course of events, right? Not your doing, but you start contemplating these thoughts, and that's not your doing, the contemplation. It's part of the functioning of your particular makeup. That deepens the understanding, and then the misunderstanding arises according to your makeup, and the deepening or the understanding arises at whatever capacity it has based on how deep it is. So none of this has anything to do with our doing, but it's happening. We can't deny that our understanding is going deeper, if it is. We can't deny that the suffering is getting cut off quicker and quicker, if it is. But we also can't say, I'm doing it, because we see that my understanding went deeper because in a particular moment there was an insight. And that insight was a result of a thread of contemplation that I started having, and that thread of contemplation happened because I saw a YouTube clip of a teacher I don't normally see. And why did I see that YouTube clip? Because YouTube suggested it. So you see, it's like all of that happened, but I wasn't in control of YouTube suggesting it. Then someone says, well, I was in control of clicking on the button. You actually clicked on the button because the title was a fancy title on the video. Yes, but then I chose to click on it. Yeah, but you chose to click on it because your genes and up-to-date conditioning, in light of that title and everything else that was in the circumstance, forced you to press the button to watch it. And then when you clicked on it, you had no idea what the teacher was going to say. And he said this, this, and this, and then after that, a series of contemplating happened based on the subject matter that was in there. And then at a certain point, there was an insight. Oh, I get that aspect. And that clearly becomes part of your deepening understanding. Definitely not our doing from a certain perspective. Looking at it a certain way. Definitely all are happening. Because YouTube was invented at some point. Because the universe came into existence at some point.
It feels wrong sometimes to feel those energies that you're saying, because there's no cut off, no concept cutting it off.
Mm-hmm.
And I have become that victim, and so to feel that feels wrong. So I don't know, like.
Yeah. So once again, if the system is not equipped in any way, and someone just hears, feel the feelings, they can feel it, and then if it's a victim feeling, let's say, it just becomes a reinforcing of that victimization, and that reinforcing of the victimization isn't really, it's definitely not a release. There's a difference between expressing a feeling and it being released. They're two different things. So just expressing energy is not necessarily the same as it being released. Release is when it's expressed and the system is equipped in a way that has enough understanding about non-doership and attachment that the non-doership and attachment energy that is being expressed is simultaneously being released, which is not something we're doing. It just means that the system is equipped or shaped in a certain way that expression becomes, by default, release or partial release.
How do you know the difference?
You don't, I mean, well, you do, as you experience the difference between the two, you'll, through contrast, be able to know how they feel different. Often, one of the telltale signs is when these energies come up, they're super intense, and then in an instant, it's finished. And it's like, wow, I remember myself being completely overcome by a very, very intense energy 2 minutes ago. And yet now it feels like that's completely irrelevant. That's a good sign of release. Whereas if we're just expressing it, and in fact it's reinforcing the victimization, after the expression there isn't much sense of relief from the heaviness of the feeling. Which doesn't mean you're doing it wrong, it just means that the system isn't equipped to release. So, you know, this goes right down to the principle of non-doership. This is saying life put in place the errors of doership and attachment to outcome, not our doing, but they're there as a result of the circumstance we found ourselves in and the way we were forced to relate to the circumstance based on the beliefs that were getting put in place, and then that deepened the beliefs, which means the next time it happened we relate to the circumstance that way again, which deepens the belief, which is not our doing because life put the seeds in place that forced it to snowball. And then at a certain time life starts reversing the process by introducing this new information that wasn't there before. And that process then snowballs. And the snowballing into misunderstanding is impersonal. We're sort of forced down that road because a seed is put in place. So the seed may be what's referred to in Christianity, for example, as original sin. The way I would see it, so sin in Latin means error. So the original error that we were born with, or that was inevitably going to grow as a result of the development of the human being, the original error is the belief in doership and attachment to outcome, which another way is the error of separation. Because as soon as the belief in doership kicks in, which means the belief that there's a circle around me and I am separate, independent, insulated, not affected by life, any decision I make is my decision, which completely misses the fact any decision you make is a result of the family you grew up in. Any decision you make was a result of the genes and the intellect that your system was given. So the belief in personal doership imagines this separate entity. So the original sin, not sin that you are punished for, but the original error that life put in place is that of separation, or that of doership and attachment to outcome. And life then starts undoing that, both of which are impersonal movements.